Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Karl Korsch, A Study in Western Marxism by Patrick Goode. Chapter 4 is titled Marxism and Philosophy, as in the book Marxism and Philosophy by Karl Korsch. Okay, so here we go. The immediate post-war years had seen Korsch closely involved with the concrete political problems of the day, first the Socialization movement, then the factory councils. But at the same time, Korsch was writing on the basic aspects of Marxism as they related to such problems, for example, in the Quintessence and the introduction to the critique of the Goethe program. His next work, Marxism and Philosophy, seems to mark a departure. At first sight, the relation indicated in the title seems to be one of a, quote, history of ideas, and of the most arid variety, tracing the influence of A upon B, and in the case of Marxism, requiring the painstaking exegesis of fragmentary texts. This might give interesting information about the genesis of Marx's ideas and the logic of their development, but it does not seem to have that relevance to practice with which Korsch was always concerned. Yet at the time, it was thought that this apparently scholastic question did have a bearing on practical problems of the highest importance, so much so that in 1924, the year after Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy and Lukács's History and Class Consciousness were published, it became the center of heated debates in the Communist International. To understand why this was so, the debate has to be seen in its political context, since this is only partly made explicit in the book Marxism and Philosophy. A brief sketch will be offered here. Despite the tremendous convulsions of 1918 to 1919, the old order in Germany had largely survived intact, even in a situation as apparently favorable to communist ideology as that of 1918, with the openly, quote, bourgeois parties discredited by their presumed responsibility for the war, and the main socialist party, the SPD, losing its traditional support for the same reason. The powerful movements of protest which occurred did not affect any fundamental change in the political structure. The SPD could produce, quote, Marxist explanations for its passivity and, as the communists saw it, its, quote, counter-revolutionary role during this period. They argued that the objective conditions for a successful transition to socialism were lacking. In an economy ruined by the war, it would be utopian to undertake any, quote, Bolshevik experiments, which would end in disaster. As they claimed, which would end in disaster, as they claimed it happened in the Soviet Union. The communists, on the other hand, argued that the, quote, objective conditions were completely adequate. It was the subjective factor, the will of a conscious political organization aiming to seize power which was lacking. Translated into philosophical terms, the communist criticism of the Social Democrats emphasized the factors of will and consciousness. The determinist, quote, scientific formulae of the Second International seemed to be seriously at fault in ignoring the necessity for conscious action, if capitalism was to be overthrown. But at the same time, how could Marxism's claim to be a science, with the, quote, determinism that such a claim involves, be justified? It was considered necessary to return to the locus classicus of the discussion of such questions, the philosophical debates about freedom and causality, determinism and voluntarism, i.e. back to Kant and Hegel. To understand their ideas on these questions, it would be necessary to see them in their social context. Korsch drew the following parallel between philosophy and social movements. Quote, since the Marxist system is the theoretical expression of the revolutionary movement of the proletariat, and German idealist philosophy is the theoretical expression of the revolutionary movement of the bourgeoisie, they must stand intelligently and historically, i.e. ideologically, in the same relation to each other as the revolutionary movement of the proletariat, as a class, stands to the revolutionary movement of the bourgeoisie in the realm of social and political practice. Korsch. Conventional historians of ideas are quite prepared to admit that Kant and Hegel did make an intellectual revolution, but they conceive it as, quote, a nice quiet process that takes place in the pure realm of the study, and far away from the crude realm of real struggles, end quote. Korsch. The two great German philosophers of the bourgeois revolution were quite unaware of the connections between their intellectual revolution and the real revolution in France. Their ideas cannot be appreciated unless its connection is taken into account. Only by rediscovering the practical element in their philosophy can the distinctive point of view of Marxism be understood. Korsch aimed to go back to the roots of Marxism in order to re-establish an authentic version, which, being quite distinct from the vulgar Marxism of the SPD, would offer a satisfactory practical alternative. Before I review the results of this inquiry, the limits of this chapter must be defined. It will take us to the point at which Korsch had evolved a coherent system of philosophical ideas, which were at a time more or less compatible with membership of the Communist Party of Germany. Some references will be made to the book, The Present State of the Problem of Marxism and Philosophy, in which Korsch answered criticisms of the original work made by social democrats and communists. These replies to criticism will be introduced only insofar as they are made from the same standpoint as the book, Marxism and Philosophy. A later chapter will examine the new positions to be found in the Anti-Critique, the book, the Anti-Critique. In particular, his revised views on Lenin's philosophy, which are connected to a much broader change of opinion about the nature of the Soviet state and to an even more fundamental change in his estimation of Marxism itself. Let's now turn to his ideas on Marxism and philosophy during this earlier period. The book Marxism and Philosophy begins by showing that after 1850 there was very little interest in Hegel or the young Hegelians, and that Marx's philosophy attracted even less attention. In the opinion of the professors of philosophy, quote, Marxism was at best a rather minor subsection within the history of 19th century philosophy, dismissed as the, quote, decay of Hegelianism, end quote, Korsch. But even the Marxists placed very little value on Marx as a philosopher. The problems of Marx's philosophy had not played a major part in the theoretical discussions of the Second International. Korsch stated this point very forcefully, quote, the prominent Marxist theoreticians of the period regarded concern with questions that were not even essentially philosophical in the narrower sense, but were only related to the general epistemological and methodological bases of Marxist theory as at most an utter waste of time and effort, end quote. And I don't know how true this is in general, but it seems like, especially in the Russian scene, at least in my opinion, the Russian scene, Plekhanov, Bogdanov, Lenin, amongst others, philosophical questions, especially those pertaining to Engels' ideas about dialectics, natural dialectics, dialectics of nature, and so forth. His Marxist metaphysics, which is a term that they would abhor, because but in their terminology, metaphysics just means the stagnant, like idealist kind of metaphysics. But you can have a metaphysics that presupposes the permanence of change, and it still be a metaphysics, and that's precisely what they're doing. They might be using scientific examples to demonstrate empirical examples that are established by natural science, or like at least ostensibly established by natural science to make their points, but they're still engaging in metaphysical practice with appeals to natural science, which is somewhat different than a metaphysics that is strictly based on, say, introspection. In more detail, the argument is as follows. There are three limits to the bourgeois history of philosophy, which have meant that bourgeois philosophers and historians have progressively abandoned the dialectical conception of the history of philosophy. First, a, quote, purely philosophical limit. They did not see that the ideas contained in a philosophy can live on, not only in philosophies, but also in the positive sciences and social practice. Secondly, a, quote, local limit. German professors in philosophy failed to see that, although the Hegelian system no longer flourished in Germany, it continued to do so in other countries. Thirdly, a, quote, class limit. Bourgeois philosophers could not transcend the bourgeois class standpoint. Thus, given that Marx's materialist philosophy emerged from the, quote, most advanced system of revolutionary bourgeois idealism, end quote, and that bourgeois historians of philosophy were prevented by the limits mentioned from understanding Hegelian idealism, it is clear that they would completely ignore Marxist philosophy. To grasp this connection between German idealism and Marxism, Korsch claims that it is necessary to adopt an approach that need not be specifically Marxist, but is just, quote, straightforwardly dialectical, end quote. Quote, straightforwardly dialectical, end quote, in the Hegelian and Marxist sense. The argument so far is only an introduction to the main theme. Is Marxism itself a philosophy? Korsch answers that a necessary result of the new dialectical materialist standpoint was the supersession not only of bourgeois idealist philosophy, but simultaneously of all philosophy as such. Without developing the argument at this point, he draws a parallel between the abolition of philosophy and the abolition of the state, and asks what is the significance of the fact that both these problems were neglected by the Marxists of the Second International. He now states the central, extremely ambitious aim of his work, quote, "We must try to understand every change, development, and revision of Marxist theory since its original emergence from the philosophy of German idealism as a necessary product of its epoch, ... More precisely, we should seek to understand their determination by the totality of the historico-social process of which they are a general expression," end quote. Korsch. Applying Marx's principle of dialectical materialism to the whole history of Marxism, Korsch finds that three major stages of the development through which Marxism has passed since its birth can be distinguished. In the first period from 1843, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, to the Revolution of 1848, Communist Manifesto, Marxist theory is still permeated through and through with philosophical thought. The second period extends from 1848 to the end of the century. In this latter phase, the various components of the theory of Marxism are further separated out into economic, political, and ideological elements. Yet the unbreakable connection between theory and practice was in no way abolished in the later form of his system. In the third phase, which extends, quote, "from the start of this century to the present and into an indefinite future," end quote, Korsch, Marxists came to regard scientific socialism as a set of purely scientific observations without any immediate connection to the political struggle. Marxism then tended to become either a kind of heuristic principle of specialized theoretical investigation or a general systematic sociology. This applied to both the, quote, revisionists, such as Bernstein, and the defenders of, quote, orthodoxy, as represented by Hilferding, who argued that the Marxist conception of socialism as a necessity did not lead to any particular practical orientation. Why had these changes taken place in Marxism? Korsch's answer is that, quote, "the decline of the original Marxist theory of social revolution into a theoretical critique of society without any revolutionary consequences is for dialectical materialism a necessary expression of parallel changes in the social practice of the proletarian struggle," end quote. Korsch. There was a long period in the second half of the 19th century when it had no practical revolutionary task to accomplish. This was the basis for revisionism in the Marxist movement. But the 20th century has placed revolutionary tasks before the working class, and the apparent revival of original Marxist theory in the Third International is a result of the revival of the revolutionary workers' movement. In this revival of Marxism-Leninism, re-established the connection between theory and practice in relation to the problem of the state. Korsch aims to do the same for the problem of philosophy. What does this entail? At this point, Korsch mentions philosophy only briefly before passing on to another argument. Korsch repeats the point that scientific socialism stands much closer to the philosophy of the Third Estate than it does to the pure sciences of bourgeois society. He now immediately passes on to the problem of ideology. To avoid the question of the mutual relations of social revolution and ideology, before the seizure of state power leads to opportunism and creates a crisis within Marxism after the revolution, it can have equally disastrous results. It leads Korsch to the question, quote, "How is Marxist materialism related to ideology in general," end quote. Marxism and Philosophy. Marx effected the transition to materialism in his book, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, yet there was relatively little difference in theoretical character between the new proletarian science and previous philosophy. German idealism had constantly tended to be more than a theory. It aimed to be practical. Korsch's main argument about ideology is its material reality. Quote, No really dialectical materialist conception of history could cease to regard philosophical ideology, or ideology in general, as a material component of general socio-historical reality, in Korsch. By contrast, for vulgar Marxism, there are 3 degrees of reality: the economy, law and the state, and pure ideology. For Marx, although the critique of political economy is theoretically and practically the first priority, it includes a critique of all the forms of consciousness of bourgeois society. Thus, in this critique, as in every dialectic, consciousness and reality coincide. Marx's dialectical materialism is not merely a form of thought which can be applied to any content. Here, as before, Korsch speaks of the similarities between the Marxist and the Hegelian dialectic. There are 2 important differences. Hegel, quote, inserted the world into philosophy far more than he did philosophy into the world, end quote. Korsch. The forms of consciousness cannot be abolished through thought alone. It would be a dangerous misunderstanding of the latter point to argue that criticism in practice simply replaces criticism in theory. What is important is not only human practice, but also the comprehension of this practice. Korsch's concluding argument is that, quote, just as political action is not rendered unnecessary by the economic action of a revolutionary class, so intellectual action is not rendered unnecessary by either political or economic action, end quote. It says rendered necessary, but I think it's supposed to say rendered unnecessary. I think it's a typo. Why did Korsch think that the neglect of the problem of Marxism and philosophy was so significant? The answer to this question is not easily to be found in Korsch's book. Indeed, one of the problems in understanding the book Marxism and Philosophy is to determine precisely what its problematic is, because it is not set out very clearly or systematically in the work itself. Korsch's major work on philosophy, although it only runs to 70-odd pages, is always complex and often obscure, perhaps overreacting to the systematization involved in the normal presentation of German academic philosophy. Korsch presents his ideas very fluidly. The opening paragraph states rather blandly, quote, until very recently, neither bourgeois nor Marxist thinkers had much appreciation for the fact that the relation between Marxism and philosophy might pose a very important theoretical and practical problem, in Korsch. Although the problem is restated several times during the course of the work, Korsch does not give an extended systematic exposition of his own position. The problem remains of understanding why the neglect of philosophy and the coincidence of bourgeois and social democratic views is so significant. To be properly criticized, the problematic has to be made more evident than it is in Korsch's work. I suggest the argument can be reconstructed as follows. The real question Korsch is moving towards, via an examination of philosophical issues, is that of ideology. So far in his Marxist period, he had not tackled the problem in a general systematic fashion. Although the book, Labor Law for Factory Councils, had dealt with legal ideology, it contained very few statements about ideology in general. Those it does make are rather crude and approach the position criticized in the book Marxism and Philosophy, which regards ideology as immaterial. Thus, in discussing the general relations between law and economy in capitalist society, he concludes, quote, there is a glaring contradiction between the ideology of bourgeois society, and its reality. The freedom and equality of the parties to the, quote, free contract of labor, end quote, is revealed to be merely an ideological disguise for a naked, brutal power relationship, end quote. Korsch. The, quote, disguise, Verkleidung, could be removed at will. In fact, it is not even present in the later stages of capitalism. Capitalist ideology is itself eventually overcome as the capitalist economy develops. Quote, capitalist ideology is eventually disproved and overcome by the development of capitalism itself. Ultimately, they, bracket, the capitalists, in bracket, are also compelled to throw off the ideological disguise behind which they had previously kept concealed their private class rule, end quote. Korsch. This is rather a conspiratorial conception of ideology, which is much closer to the mechanical notions of ideology held by the Social Democrats, in that it seems to suggest that ideology is merely a, quote, disguise of the reality of capitalist society, which can be removed at the will of the dominant classes in that society. If this were so, then ideology could not pose an important problem for Marxists. Before the revolution, they could not do anything to combat hostile ideologies because such ideologies would only vanish at the will of the ruling powers. After the revolution, with the disappearance of these ruling powers, the ideology at their disposal would vanish with them. On a less favorable reading of the second passage above, one might conclude that ideology poses less of a problem to Marxists than it did previously. This would be quite consistent with the notion of Sozialrecht, developed in labor law for factory councils. Yet in the book, Marxism and Philosophy, Korsch holds that the question of ideology is of the highest importance. Quote, to avoid these questions in the period before the proletarian revolution leads to opportunism and creates a crisis within Marxism, just as avoidance of the problem of state and revolution in the Second International led to opportunism and indeed provoked a crisis in the camp of Marxism. End quote. Korsch makes an even stronger claim that a neglect of this problem has very serious consequences not only before but also after the revolution. If the lack of a clear theoretical understanding is not remedied, the construction of socialism could be seriously hampered. The reference to the, quote, problem of the state, end quote, in the passage quoted above is significant. Korsch saw the main aim of his work as doing for the question of ideology what Lenin had done for the question of the state. This was part of the, quote, renewal of Marxism. Quote, a fresh examination of the problem of Marxism and philosophy would also seem to be an important part of this restoration, end quote. He adds that the attempt to, quote, restore the Marxist method in connection with the problems of ideology poses great problems. What is meant here by, quote, restoration? Korsch explains this by using the example of Lenin's work. Its significance was that it had rediscovered the method of Marxism. But this was not simply a textual, quote, restoration, a, quote, correct reading, but a further development of Marxist thought using his method. Quote, the preface and first page of State and Revolution proved that Lenin was also just as far from considering the main purpose of this theoretical work to be the ideological, quote, re-establishment of true Marxist doctrine, end quote. Korsch was heavily influenced by Lenin's recent pronouncements on philosophy in favor of studying Hegel. Indeed, this may be said to be one of the immediate motives for Korsch's writing the book, Marxism and Philosophy, namely to fulfill Lenin's injunction, quote, we must organize a systematic study of the Hegelian dialectic from a materialist standpoint, end quote, which appears at the beginning of the book. The full extent of Lenin's, quote, Hegelianism was not known at the time. He had read Hegel's logic for the first time during the war and kept a series of notebooks not published until 1929 in which Lenin recorded his impressions. These private notes on, quote, Hegelianism were very forceful. Quote, it is impossible to completely understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Consequently, half a century later, none of the Marxists understood Marx, and quote, Lenin. His study of the Hegelian dialectic and its influence on Marxism revealed itself in a number of articles. For example, those on the trade union question, on the article on, quote, militant materialism, and quote, from which Korsch's quotation is taken. The published pronouncements from such an authority in the communist movement as Lenin gave in it added impetus to the Hegel Renaissance in Marxist circles. Despite the importance of Korsch's work, the leading figure in this Renaissance was Lukács. His major published contribution to the debate was the immensely influential book, History and Class Consciousness, a history of essays published in 1925 and written in the preceding 4 years. In addition to this work, there were at the time extensive discussions of these problems, which unfortunately went unrecorded. In the summer of 1922, for example, Felix Weil, who's like the sponsor of the Frankfurt School, sponsored a, quote, Marxist Work Week, which met in Ilmenau, Thuringia, and in which Lukács, Korsch, Wittfogel, and other leading Marxist intellectuals took part. Korsch had published Weil's monograph on socialization in 1921 and was one of the first people to interest him in Marxism. Much of the time was apparently devoted to a discussion of Korsch's manuscript for the book Marxism and Philosophy. Expectations of a second work week came to nothing when it was replaced by a much more ambitious venture, the Frankfurt Institute, which was officially set up on the 3rd of February 1923. Thus there was a close personal and ideological link between Korsch and Lukács, and it is a central aim of this chapter to examine their similarities and differences. Apart from continuing Lenin's work of, quote, restoring the Marxist method and applying it to new problems, is there any connection between the two questions, that of the state and philosophy, which the, quote, revisionists had overlooked? Rather formally, Korsch claims that they had neglected the two problems because the, quote, problems of the revolution in general hardly concerned them, bracket, the Marxists of the Second International, end bracket, end quote. This criticism is itself too general and offers an instructive contrast between the methods of Lenin and Korsch. Lenin did not have a theory of revolution in general, nor for that matter a theory of ideology in general, nor any particular ideologies of the state, philosophy, economics, or anything else. Lenin always criticized particular ideologies as they presented themselves as concrete questions in the course of class struggle. Thus, chronologically, Lenin analyzed the development of capitalism in Russia, the agrarian question, philosophy, imperial criticism, imperialism, the state, and so on. He was never concerned with, quote, the problems of the revolution in general, end quote, only with the specific problems facing the revolutionary movement. Perhaps what underlay Korsch's argument was a notion that was to become dominant later in, quote, Western Marxism, that the problem of ideology was much more important for the revolution in Western Europe than it had been for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. In this conception, the main function of the state itself was, in Western Europe, ideological, not repressive. The model statement of this, quote, Western Marxist perspective was made by Gramsci, quote, in Russia the state was everything. Civil society was primordial and gelatinous. In the West, there was a proper relation between state and civil society, and when the state trembled, a sturdy structure of civil society was at once revealed. The state was only an outer ditch behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses and earthquakes, and Gramsci. It was the conventional wisdom of the Comintern itself that it would be much more difficult in the countries of Western Europe for the proletariat to seize power, but that thereafter it would be much easier for them to retain and expand their power. While the Comintern held this view, it did not expand on these difficulties, particularly in the arena of ideological struggle. Korsch seems to have thought, without making it explicit as this, that the book, Marxism and Philosophy, would supplement Lenin's work in precisely this way. This seems to be some of these things about the power of the state in Western Europe, not merely as a repressive apparatus, but also like an ideological apparatus, when you use those terms. What's the word? Anachronistically. Or something like that. Was something that's very much emphasized by the Council Communists, right? The Council Communists' main critique of one of the main splits that led to the formation of like a German-Dutch left communist current was this idea that the Comintern, which is dominated by Moscow, did not have adequate sensitivity to the intensive ideological power that the state had for the working class in Western Europe, in the developed Western Europe, and that for them what was necessary was to break the working classes like illusions in the state, or like what's the word? Foster their self-confidence, foster their self-initiative, foster their will to self-determination, and not supplicating, and reduce their supplication and deference that they delivered towards the state and authority and bureaucracy in general. That was what was important to the left communists, from my understanding. The left communists, which became the Council Communists. Where am I? I forget where I was, but while the Comintern held this view, it did not expand on these difficulties, particularly in the arena of ideological struggle. Korsch seems to have thought, without making it as explicit as this, that Marxism and philosophy would supplement Lenin's work in precisely this way. This is the reason behind Korsch's statement that, quote, therefore we must solve in a dialectically materialist fashion not only the, quote, question of the relationship of the state and of social revolution to the state, end quote, Lenin, but also the, quote, question of the relationship of ideology to social revolution and of social revolution to ideology, end quote, Korsch. Let's now examine Korsch's argument more directly. Since Korsch did not define ideology very precisely at any point, a formal comparison of the definitions he gave is not very revealing. He says that in the, quote, vulgar materialist conception, there are three stages of reality. Quote, 1. The economy, which in the last instance is the only objective and totally non-ideological reality. 2. Law and the state, which are already somewhat less real because clad in ideology. And 3. Pure ideology, which is objectless and totally unreal. Quote, pure rubbish, end quote, Korsch. The definition Korsch suggests is, quote, in there, bracket Marx and Engels, and bracket terminology, only the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophical forms of consciousness are ideological. Even these need not be so in all conditions, but become so only under specific conditions, end quote, Korsch. He even suggests that at one time Marx himself had a philosophical standpoint which he would, according to the later use of the word, have characterized as thoroughly ideological. Marx only freed himself from this youthful error by a long and difficult process of reasoning. The problems of defining Korsch's concept of ideology is not made any easier by the fact that he never explains what he means by, quote, science. Korsch constantly criticizes the positivist notion of science, which was implicit in the, quote, scientific socialism of the Second International, but mainly on the grounds that it does not lead to revolutionary practice. Science remains a passive instrument of analysis, not a guide to action. Because he does not give an adequate exposition of this concept, of his concept of science, his concept of ideology remains unclear. Thus we cannot learn from the formal definitions alone. To get round this problem, I shall look more closely at the problems in connection with which he uses the concept, namely the category of totality, the reality of ideology, and the relationship of theory and practice. The, quote, strong thesis is sometimes stated in respect to Korsch's view of totality, i.e. that, quote, like Lukács, Korsch's key concept is that of totality, end quote. I'm not sure that quote's from. That this is an exaggeration can be shown by examining Lukács' statement of the, quote, strong thesis. Totality is central to Lukács' problematic, which he states as follows, quote, it is not the primacy of economic motives in historical explanation that constitutes the decisive difference between Marxism and bourgeois thought, but the point of view of totality. The category of totality, is the essence of the method which Marx took over from Hegel and brilliantly transformed into the foundations of a wholly new science, The primacy of the category of totality is the bearer of the principle of revolution in science. The primacy of the category of totality is the bearer of the principle of revolution in science, end quote. I really like that because I think that that's something that, like the primacy of economic motives in historical explanation is something you 100% find, and to my understanding at least, something you definitely find in people such as Adam Smith, for instance, right? And I think even to a certain extent you find that kind of like impersonal economic motives being kind of and how they lead to like a globalized like world order, a world of an interdependent global order, which in his view would necessarily lead to some kind of cosmopolitan meta state. You can find that idea in like Kant, right? Anyway, Korsch does not accept or give the category of totality such a central place in the Marxist system, but Korsch does share the, quote, weak thesis with Lukács. In their search for science, the Social Democrats had effectively disintegrated Marxism into a number of separate sciences: economics, history, the theory of law and the state. In opposition to the atomizing tendencies of such a scientific approach, Korsch argues that Marxism stands for totality. For example, the critique of political economy and the critique of ideology are in no way to be mechanically separated. Since both form a, quote, unified whole, whose parts cannot be simply separated and set apart from each other, end quote, Korsch. Instead of this tendency to separation, the opposite is to be found because, quote, in Marx and Engels, however, this separation, in bracket, never produces a multiplicity of independent elements instead of the whole. It is merely that another combination of the components of the system emerges, developed with greater scientific precision and built on the infrastructure of the critique of political economy, end quote. Korsch. But for Korsch, this is merely part of his case against the version of science accepted by the, quote, revisionists. The category of totality has a much more negative character. It is in no sense elevated to a central organizing principle as it is by Lukács. For Korsch, the tendency of bourgeois science to fragmentation could not be countered simply by postulating that in Marxist science, the individual sciences of economics, history, etc., are not self-sufficient, but are components of a totality. This would still leave those sciences devoid of content, which is in fact a result of Lukács' position. Lukács' concept of totality is therefore quite formalistic. In order to give a distinctive content to the Marxist critique of ideology, we must turn to the second aspect of Korsch's concept of ideology. Korsch emphasized that, no less than economics, ideology was a material reality. This is perhaps the most distinctive feature of Korsch's position. The, quote, orthodox Marxist, end quote, had known how to state this truth abstractly in opposing the anarchist denial of certain, quote, superstructural elements, end quote, such as the state and politics. Whereas in the critique of anarchism, it was conceded that these were realities, yet, quote, in spite of this, many vulgar Marxists to this day have never, even in theory, admitted that intellectual life and forms of social consciousness are comparable realities. Quoting certain statements by Marx and especially Engels, they simply explain away the intellectual, ideological structures of society. They simply explain away the intellectual, ideological structures of society as a mere pseudo-reality which only exists in the minds of ideologues, as error, imagination, and illusion, devoid of genuine object, end quote. And this is kind of something that is like very interesting. I think this is especially when he says especially Engels, and just some of the things I've read, particularly Z.A. Jordan, among others. Mainly Z.A. Jordan, though, talks about Marxist philosophy being more adequately characterized as a naturalism than a materialism, right? Naturalism kind of is just saying that there's like its basic philosophical principle is that there's not kind of like two worlds, right? There's not some kind of like timeless ideal world, which includes things like God and the soul and shit like that, and then like a material animal world of physical life or physical existence. There's one thing, and it is physical. There is one existence, right? It's a monism. I think this might be a good way to describe it. And if you have a monist and you have that naturalism, that does not necessarily mean that you kind of say that materialism is the. Does not necessarily mean that matter is like the defining substance of reality, right? That's a more concrete version, a more specific version of an overall arching naturalism. So Marx's metaphysics, I guess you'd say, about the cosmos is more defined as as what you could call like naturalism, or maybe like even like secularism, humanism, if you want to go that far, which is distinct from saying that matter is the fundamental element, fundamental substance of reality, which seems to be more of the position of Engels. And people following that in dialectical materialism kind of draw on the Engelsian tradition. If you think that matter's fundamental things that kind of that have a more sociological, less empirically verifiable character, like ideas, right? You tend to view them as like epiphenomenal, as kind of like stemming from some kind of lower order that is the material world, right? If you have like a reductive materialism, not necessarily, I don't know if you necessarily could say that Engels or anybody actually has that kind of view of materialism, but you could. Some people, I think some people would. Um, but the idea that um, you see this also in but if you think of people like I was just reading the autobiography, or not the autobiography, the biography by John Gerber of Pannekoek, and Pannekoek has this idea of like um, intellectual ideologies just being as much a part of like the material world as like stuff, like earthy, tangible stuff. It's not like some kind of like second order pseudo reality, which is the word that Korsch uses here, or an epiphenomenon, meaning something which is caused but can't have causal influence on the world. Um, he he rejects this position. So this is something that Pannekoek's already saying. I think Pannekoek's saying this rather early on in the early 20th century. I mean, I might be not be remembering what he says, right? So there is this tradition of like bucking against kind of like a kind of against materialism. It seems like this kind of like diamat kind of thing, especially for it seems like for certain segments of the socialist theoretical world, especially in the case of Pannekoek. Joseph Dietzken was probably more influential, it seems, than Engels. Um, so yeah, and just to say, like Marx being a materialist, like there's also I think a very important distinction to be talked about when like you're talking about like what is materialism, because a lot of times like materialism in the philosophical sense, in the strict philosophical sense, in the metaphysical sense, refers to like what is the fundamental like substance of like the world, right? Which is like material things, you know, or and in the case of dialectical materialism, it would be like material things in like flux, right? Um, Whereas the materialism in the sense of historical materialism refers very much so not just to like stuff or like material or technological substratums, but like production as such, which is a much broader open thing than just like technological apparatuses, right? Like Marx says somewhere that's like um, something to the effect of like production is not just production, but like a whole form of life, right? Um, so this very this I don't know this past quote, which I'll just reread again because I've kind of gotten away from it, is quote, in spite of this, many vulgar Marxists to this day have never even in theory admitted that intellectual life into forms of social consciousness or comparable realities. Quoting certain statements by Marx and especially Engels, they simply explain away the intellectual ideological structures of society as a mere pseudo-reality which only exists in the minds of ideologues as error, imagination, and illusion, devoid of a genuine object. Unquote. Korsch. Political and legal concepts are at least related to something real, namely the state and politics. They thus derive a kind of second-hand reality. Other varieties of ideology, mainly simply, quote, ideas in men's heads, end quote. This view of ideology is in philosophical terms a variety of idealism, in that ideas are not thought to reflect anything objective in the real world. This idealist standpoint had been explicitly criticized by Marx in his preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, in which he stated that he had taken a major methodological step forward in understanding that ideas are rooted in material reality and themselves form part of this reality. Korsch had already made this point about the relation of ideas to reality in a commentary on Engels' book Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Korsch quoted a well-known passage from Engels' book, quote, scientific socialism, ... is the expression of the proletarian movement, end quote, and commented, quote, this means A, it is not a thing for itself, ... but a component of real events, a, quote, movement, more precisely, of, quote, action, the action of the, quote, oppressed class, end quote, the proletariat. B, it is a special component of this movement, something special within the whole, end quote. Korsch. The view of the, quote, immateriality unquote, of ideologies has important political consequences. It renders the ideological struggle unnecessary both before and after the revolution. It implies a certain conception of the relation of ideas to reality. In philosophical terms, naive realism, quote, which considers thought independent of being and defines truth as the correspondence of thought to an object that is external to it. It is only this outlook that can sustain the view that all forms of economic consciousness have an objective meaning because they correspond to reality. End quote. Korsch. When ideas are conceived in this way as mere, quote, images, Bilder, of the external world, they will naturally vanish with the transformation of the external world. This philosophical correlate of the SPD's view is not extensively criticized in this point. Here, too, bourgeois views in philosophy and on the state coincide. Quote, bourgeois consciousness necessarily sees itself as apart from the world and independent of it as pure critical philosophy and impartial science, just as the bourgeois state and bourgeois law appear to be above society. End quote. Korsch. But there is a problem with the notion of the materiality of ideology. It seems quite appropriate to apply the thesis that socialism as an ideology is a material part of the movement of the, quote, oppressed class to the period in Marx's lifetime when he was involved with such movements, e.g. the period of the Communist Manifesto. But is it appropriate to other periods, e.g. when the, quote, mature Marx was writing more detached works such as Capital? Korsch claimed that in fact the stimulus for writing even Capital came from the movement of the, quote, oppressed classes, unquote. Quote, the new autonomous science of the working class attained its developed theoretical form in literature at the same time as the new autonomous movement of the proletariat achieved its practical form in history, end quote. Korsch. What Korsch was referring to was the London building workers' strike and the founding of the First International. Despite Korsch's answer, the concept of ideology does undergo numerous changes in Marx's works. This warrants closer examination of the relation of the early writings to the, quote, more mature, end quote, works such as Capital. In fact, a key point in Kautsky's criticism of Korsch concerned the two parts of Marx's work. In general terms, In fact, a key point in Kautsky's criticism of Korsch concerned the two parts of Marx's work. In general terms, he includes Korsch in a criticism of all communists who, quote, prefer to rely on primitive Marxism, on the apprentice works which Marx and Engels wrote from before their 30th year up to the 1848 revolution and its after effects. Apart from individual phrases, they don't know what to do with their later works, i.e., quote, Capital, end quote, Kautsky. Marx himself, continues Kautsky, had admitted that many of the analyses and demands made in their early period of involvement in a revolutionary movement had become out of date. It is precisely these obsolescent features of Marxism which were adopted by Marxists. They had taken over a program which Marx had prepared for absolutist conditions in Germany in the 1840s and applied it to similarly absolutist conditions in Russia. Yet when faced with the very different situation of a democratic England, Marx and Engels had been scientific enough to change their views. This problem of the relation of the, quote, philosophical young Marx to the, quote, scientific author of Marx's Capital has come to the fore again recently in the work of Althusser, who takes a similar position to Kautsky's. By contrast, Korsch insisted that even in the later works, quote, this revolutionary will is latent, yet present in every sentence of Marx's work, and erupts again and again in every decisive passage, especially in the first volume of Capital. End quote. Korsch. However, Korsch admits that in their later work, Marx and Engels had transcended philosophy, in the form in which it appeared at the time of the theses on Feuerbach. Dialectical materialism was in essence still a philosophy, even though they thought that its main task was to change the conditions of social existence, which produced philosophy. Marx's opinion of this was shown by the fact that, quote, he would no longer allow this work to be printed, and in the real mature period of his life, did not place a great value on the, quote, critique of ideology, end quote, unquote. Korsch. Thus, the historical relation of philosophy to the rest of Marx's work is clear. But what of the logical status of philosophy in his later work? I will conclude my analysis of his concept of ideology before dealing with this problem. The last element on Korsch's concept of ideology follows from the preceding argument. If ideas have no materiality, then there is no sense in which the unity of theory and practice can be achieved. This is one of the major points of his critique of the, quote, orthodox Marxists' conception of science. They held that the impartiality and objectivity of science are guaranteed by the fact that it is not based on any preconceptions. In Korsch's view, Marxists should not contest the results of, quote, bourgeois science, but should oppose this whole way of thinking about science. Quote, while therefore bourgeois philosophy and science chase after the delusive phantom of, quote, being without assumptions, unquote, Marxism rejects this illusion in all its parts. It does not aim to be a, quote, pure science or philosophy, but instead aims to criticize the, quote, impurity of all previous bourgeois science and philosophy by a ruthless exposure of its tacit, quote, assumptions, end quote, end quote. And that's kind of a pretty radical historicist conception of science, which is kind of like what the earmark of like summary of like, that's kind of like the summary that a lot of people contribute to Korsch is like radical historicism. Here Korsch was on good authority as far as Marx's own writings were concerned. In the book, The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx had claimed that the conventional economists had been able to explain how production takes place given certain presuppositions which remain tacit. It was those very presuppositions which needed explanation. In the, quote, revisionist view, Marxism was a pure science, quite unrelated to any particular class or class struggle. Quote, later Marxists came to regard scientific socialism more and more as a set of purely scientific observations without any immediate connection to the political or other practices of class struggle, end quote. Korsch. This conception of Marxism as a science would turn Marxism into a science which accepted, quote, bourgeois methodology, but simply achieved different results. Not only conventional social democrats, but also some theoreticians of the Comintern, chiefly Bukharin, had a tendency to accept a positivist methodology of this kind. All such thinkers, quote, believe that the question of, quote, scientific method is solved once and for all in the empirical method of the natural sciences and the corresponding positive historical method, end quote, Korsch. However, a thorough critique of positivism would go farther. It would examine the adequacy of the positivist conception of natural science itself, and not merely its notion that the methods of natural science should be applied to the social sciences. Korsch did not carry his criticisms thus far, being mainly interested in criticizing the attempts to class Marxism as a science under the heading of sociology. At this stage, Korsch's rejection of sociology is quite emphatic. Korsch dismisses it as one of the, quote, special sciences, end quote, of bourgeois society, merely distinguished by its newness, as compared to older sciences such as the science of law, Rechtswissenschaft. But Korsch warns against the tendency infiltrating the Third International, quote, there are some modern Marxist theoreticians who belong in practice to revolutionary communism, but who come near to equating the Marxist conception of history with a, quote, general sociology, end quote, Korsch. The two works he claims to belong to this tendency are Karl Wittvogel's Die Wissenschaft der bürgerlichen Gesellschaft and Bukharin's Theory of Historical Materialism. I have a piece that's on Wittvogel's theoretical output, but it's mostly about his conception, his works on like Oriental despotism. As far as Bukharin goes, his main what the hell is his main authors? He has a big biographer. He wrote a book, like a big biography of Bukharin. I have an article by him on kind of like the theoretical foundations of Bolshevism in the early 1920s, or like in the period of the revolution. Anyway, in the present context, the latter is more significant since it does show a marked tendency to turn Marxism into a, quote, Systematic General Sociology, end quote. The work itself is actually subtitled A System of Sociology. I think that's meaning Bukharin's book. That's what he says. So, in the present context, Bukharin's The Theory of Historical Materialism is more significant, since Bukharin's Theory of Historical Materialism book does show a marked tendency to turn Marxism into a, quote, systematic general sociology, end quote. The work itself, Bukharin's Theory of Historical Materialism, is actually subtitled A System of Sociology. Bukharin states that, quote, the theory of historical materialism, ... is not political economy, nor is it history. It is the general theory of society and the laws of its evolution, i.e. sociology, end quote. Bukharin. Bukharin was not to undertake a more detailed analysis. Korsch was not to undertake a more detailed analysis of Marxism and sociology until Korsch wrote the book, Karl Marx, which was recently republished a few years ago, with a introduction by Michael Buckmiller, who's probably the biggest Korsch scholar in the world. Unfortunately, I don't think any of his works are in English. At this point, he held a very definite view of the place of sociology in the Marxist system, namely that it is political economy, which is the basis of Marxist science. Korsch explains what he means by this in the book Labor Law for Factory Councils. Quote, we must consider not only the state and the law, but also that deeper layer, the economy, in political terms. We must not pursue, as the bourgeois does, quote, economics on the one side, quote, politics on the other, but, quote, political economy, end quote, Korsch. The fundamental characteristic of Marxism is not that it deals with classes rather than individuals in its explanation of history, but that such classes are economically determined. Quote, the conditions of material production ultimately determine all other conditions of human society, end quote. In his system, Bukharin sees matter quite differently. It is technology which is given the decisive place. Quote, the combination of the instruments of labor, the social technology, are the deciding factor in the combinations and relations of men, i.e. in social economy, end quote. Bukharin. Korsch criticizes this view sharply, showing how much it diverges from Marxism, when not, however, ascribing it to Bukharin. Quote, political economy is therefore not, quote, technology, but is always the science of a, quote, social subject, end quote, end quote. Korsch. This is very interesting because this is kind of like a position, at least from my knowledge, that when I remember reading like his essays on the theory of values, that is something that Isaac Elliott Rubin, right, is pushing, right, that like political economy is the critique of political economy, particularly the opening section of Capital is fundamentally is not just about not just a quantitative analysis, but a qualitative sociological, what would later be called a critical theory, and that political economy, that there's like this big struggle, which seems like so ridiculous now, but it seems like there's this big struggle on the part of like Rubin to say, listen, the object of political economy is not, it's like from a Marxist perspective, is not like some examination of the underlying technological apparatus, but the actual social relationships that constitute a given mode of production, right? And so this seems very much, as opposed to some people who are, I think, trying to like have this very reductionist view of Marxism, like in this, what Bukharin is putting forward here is an extreme technological determinist conception of Marxism, which I think is fairly common historically, at the very least, because I think this is a big part of why I make that distinction between materialism as like production and materialism as like physiological, or not physiological, but physical, like the metaphysical substratum of reality, right? They're not the same thing. Like historical materialism, and to me, and like dialectic materialism, they have and this might seem like a pretty banal statement, but they fundamentally do have different objects, right? The materialism that's in those words, there's two different uses of the word materialism, in my view, at least. So this is all very interesting because it seems like there's some kind of overlap here between what is being said by Korsch and what is being would be said by Isaac Illich Rubin. Even though I don't know how much they knew each other, I know Korsch wrote a review of Patrick, another important uh, um, scholar who was kind of like doing something kind of similar to Rubin in a lot of ways, especially drawing on the opening pages of opening chapters of Capital to derive a theory of like the legal subject and all that kind of shit. So they were kind of doing similar projects. So I know Korsch knew Patrick work. I don't know if he would have been aware of Rubin or how well Rubin would have been known on the um, international scene. We may note at this point that Lukács's objections to these works were quite different from Korsch's. His central objection to Wittfogel, for example, was that he adopted a sociologically uncritical attitude towards the method of the natural sciences, and that Wittfogel had not dealt with the connection between the rationalizing method of the natural sciences and the economic developments of capitalism. The significance of this difference is that Lukács adopted a definite position on one question which Korsch did not examine at all in the book Marxism and Philosophy, namely the dialectics of nature. In fact, the main attack on the book, History and Class Consciousness, centered on this very question. Lukács had made the following criticism of Engels, quote, the misunderstandings that arise from Engels' account of dialectics can in the main be put down to the fact that Engels, following Hegel's mistaken lead, extended the method to apply also to nature. Just as a side note, that seems like a pretty accurate thing to say about Hegel. For Hegel, right, the dialectics of dialectical logic was not like just simply a method of thinking, or a method of applying a way of thinking to like a particular object or a methodology to investigate a particular object, but somehow dialectic, somehow logos, like when he's talking about the science of logic, it's not just it's not, his object is not like logic in the sense of like the specific discipline of rational thinking, but rather talking, sinking it into the cosmos, right? So Hegel's logic is an ontologic, right? The science of logic is not just about thinking; it's about like the cosmos, the universe as such, whatever you want to put it. So saying that Engels did that as well by sinking, just like saying that like dialectics is the law of like nature as such, um, is and following Hegel's lead, that seems pretty accurate to me. But maybe I'm too biased by Lukács influenced Marx discourse. Anyway, Lukács had made the following criticism of Engels, quote, the misunderstandings that arise from Engels' account of dialectics can in the main be put down to the fact that Engels, following Hegel's mistaken lead, extended the method to apply also to nature. However, the crucial determinants of dialectics, the interaction of subject and object, the unity of theory and practice, the historical changes in the reality underlying the categories, at the root cause of changes in thought, etc., are absent from our knowledge of nature. End quote. Lukács. It is not necessary to discuss this question here, for the book Marxism and Philosophy did not say anything about the dialectics of nature, yet the critics of Lukács and Korsch, who bracketed them together, quite failed to mention that this question was not discussed in the book Marxism and Philosophy. Nor did Korsch make this position on this specific problem clear in any of his other published writings of this period. In a, quote, afterword instead of a forward, end quote, Korsch said that he agreed with the general outlines of Lukács' approach, or reserving a more detailed opinion on particular points for a future time. Looking beyond this period, a statement of 1925 repudiated the idea that there was a very close connection between them. Quote, I've never stated that I was a disciple of Lukács' theory, end quote. Korsch. In his book, Anti-Critique, in 1930, Korsch was to argue that his statement that he would reserve a detailed exposition of his differences with Lukács had been taken by his critics in the KPD to mean complete agreement. At that time, he had not been clear about their disagreements, but, quote, nevertheless, I still believe to this day that Lukács and I are objectively on the same side in our critical attitude towards the old social democratic Marxist orthodoxy, and the new communist orthodoxy, end quote. Korsch. And I think by 1930, maybe I'm wrong. I'm going to read a book about Lukács soon. It seems very much the case that well, it's pretty well known that like Lukács recanted, right? And he was very skeptical even when his work people became interested in his work, particularly in Western Europe in the 1960s and late 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. In that period, he's very like cautious and opposed, I think, in a lot of instances, to the republication of history and class consciousness. To return to Korsch's main argument, his chief concern in criticizing Bukharin and Wittfogel was to stress the practical aims of Marxism. In doing so, Korsch did not mean to argue for pragmatism, but rather for a dialectical relation between theory and practice, which would avoid two theoretical mistakes, criticized by Marx himself, present in the history of the German socialist movement at an early date. Lassalle, of the, quote, practical party, thought that practice would abolish ideology. On the other side of the debate, the, quote, philosophical party believed that there could be a purely philosophical transcendence, Aufhebung, of ideology. These opposite mistakes could be summarized thus, quote, if therefore the theoretical party believes that philosophy can be practically realized without theoretically transcending it, so equally incorrectly, the practical party aims to transcend philosophy practically without realizing philosophy theoretically, i.e. without grasping it as reality, end quote. Korsch. The solution to be found practically, not pragmatically, since the comprehension of this practice was equally necessary, quote, it is not in, quote, human practice, end quote, alone, but only in, quote, human practice and in the comprehension of this practice, end quote, that Marx as a dialectical materialist locates the rational solution of all mysteries that lure theory into mysticism, end quote. Korsch. But is the unity of theory and practice postulated here possible without changes taking place in society? This is surely problematic. It forms one of the central points of Kautsky's critique of Korsch. Quote, for Korsch, Marxism is nothing but a theory of social revolution. In reality, one of the most outstanding characteristics of Marxism is the conviction that the social revolution is only possible under certain circumstances and thus only in certain times and countries. The communist sect to which Korsch belongs has quite forgotten this. For them, the social revolution is always possible everywhere under all circumstances, end quote. Kautsky. It's very interesting. And I don't particularly know what to think about this, right? It seems like, especially with the critique of political economy, assessing any kind of like immediate political, any kind of politics that would be derived from it, such a high altitude of abstraction, would require like several mediations to come down from that high level of abstraction, in my view. Like I don't think you can just read Marx's Capital and tell you politics. That's ridiculous. Not that Korsch is saying that, but you get what I'm saying with like the, or like also like, if you think of an extreme example that I think is very similar to Korsch here, this very like theory and practice being inseparable kind of thing. I think you see this in a lot of people who are kind of like of the kind of like an ultra, in my view, a very voluntarist and damn near populist kind of reading of Marx, which I think is prevalent in, for instance, in the Johnson Forrest tendency, of the idea, kind of like what, like kind of saying that Marx kept revising Capital and so many times because there was so much new developments in the class struggle. Like this is something that Rai Dunayevskaya says, and it's like, yeah, I think the reason he wrote it is because he was looking for like the precise precise technical ways, and ways and or like ways to explain these difficult chapters, these difficult opening chapters, or something like that, like something that's kind of like imminent to the theory itself, the imminent to the theory production, and not kind of this kind of radical historicism of like kind of saying that like, oh yeah, Marx wrote Capital because of the class struggle and some kind of like, I mean, obviously that's like it has political intention. The critique of political economy definitely has like a political intention to it, and it's very much laden with a principle of non-domination, I would say. But to kind of like just say like it's like to say that there's like it's not there's like it's some kind of um, immediately practically grounded theoretical um, project seems to me like off base, right? And I think also there's like and this is a difficult thing too, but like I think also like even though ideas and stuff always have their own context, part of their context is the context of ideas, and thus saying kind of making some kind of I don't know, trying to reduce theory in some sense to its context, which would be like an earmark of a super radical historicism, um, seems to me like it would be off base. But I don't know. I don't even know that's what Korsch is saying. There's just some opinions that I have that reading this is kind of inspiring me to think about. Anyway, Kautsky's criticisms, published 1 year later, do raise a problem about Korsch's conception of the relationship between theory and practice. This criticism could also be applied to Lukács, who opened his book on Lenin with the statement that, quote, historical materialism is the theory of the proletarian revolution, end quote. Kautsky asks, isn't the materialist conception of history the result of a scientific investigation of history which took place before the revolution? Looking forward, will the Marxist theory not be still valid after the proletarian revolution, when the proletariat no longer exists? It doesn't seem like that's like a direct quote. I'm not sure if that's a direct quote or if that's... I don't think it is a direct quote. I think it's a paraphrasing. These criticisms do reveal certain weaknesses in Korsch's position. From an activist point of view, Korsch's position appears more promising, in that it attempts to tie Marxist theory more closely to the class struggle and the problems of the transition to socialism. But by stressing this practical side, it ignores the other side, the question of science. Where does the objective and necessary character of the activity of the proletariat come from? In what objective conditions is it possible to stress the active factor, the will, without falling into an empty voluntarism? Korsch's criticisms of Kautsky's passivity may be correct, but without a much more all-embracing conception of the scientific nature of Marxism and its particular view of, quote, science, parenthesis, Wissenschaft, in parenthesis, it would not be possible to arrive at a more adequate understanding of the unity of theory and practice. In fact, at one point, Korsch goes so far as to suggest that, quote, the sharp differentiation between theory and practice, characteristic of precisely this bourgeois epoch, which was unknown to philosophy even in the classical and medieval periods, is superseded for the first time in recent history, after Hegel had prepared its supersession, by the formation of his, quote, dialectical method, end quote. Korsch. This is surely an overstatement of the case for the practical bias of Marxism. It is difficult to understand how a theory could by itself overcome this dualism. The dualism between the kind of revolutionary, quote, activism, which Korsch espouses, and the scientific, quote, passivity of the Marxism of the Second International cannot be resolved within the bounds of Marxist theory itself. It would be idealist to consider the possibility of such a merely intellectual transcendence. I will now summarize what has been said so far about Korsch's concept of ideology. In Korsch's view, the critique of ideology was important because ideology formed a material part of the society Marx aimed to change. The difference between Marxist and bourgeois science did not simply lie in the different analyses they put forward. It lay in a different relation between theory and practice. Marxism aimed to understand the world in order to change it. The conflict with ideologies was of practical and not merely theoretical significance. The reasons Korsch gives for the necessity of Marxist undertaking a systematic study of the problem of ideology are to some extent valid and consistent. Sorry. Where am I? The reasons Korsch gave for the necessity The reasons Korsch gave for the necessity of Marxists undertaking a systematic study of the problem of ideology are to some extent valid and consistent, but the next step in the argument is not so clear. What is the link between the problem of ideology and philosophy? After all, Korsch himself said of philosophy that, quote, the theoretical and practical criticism of philosophy is henceforward, bracket, after their early writings, end bracket, relegated to the second, third, fourth, or even last, but one place in their critique of society, end quote. Korsch. One indirect link might be through the study of philosophy. One might thereby grasp the method of Marxism, which can then be applied to ideology. While he was writing this first critique of political economy, Marx himself had said, quote, in the method of treatment, the fact that by mere accident I have again glanced through Hegel's logic has been of great service to me, ... If there should ever be a time for such work again, I should greatly like to make accessible to the ordinary human intelligence, ... what is rational in the method which Hegel discovered, but at the same time enveloped in mysticism, end quote. Marx. How much emphasis Korsch placed on the understanding of method can be seen by comparing his position with that of Lukács, who showed the most extreme kind of preoccupation with method when he wrote at the beginning of the chapter entitled, What is Orthodox Marxism? Quote, let us assume for the sake of argument that recent research had disproved once and for all every one of Marx's individual theses. Even if this were to be proved, every serious, quote, orthodox Marxist would still be able to accept all such modern findings without reservation, and hence dismiss all of Marx's theses in toto, without having to renounce his orthodoxy for a single moment. Orthodox Marxism, therefore, does not imply the uncritical acceptance of the results of Marx's investigations. It is not the, quote, belief in this or that thesis, nor the exegesis of a, quote, sacred book. On the contrary, orthodoxy refers exclusively to method, end quote. Lukács. This is surely a remarkable statement of extreme, quote, methodologism, end quote. It is also the foundation for the claim that, in effect, what Lukács was doing was to found a new idealist philosophy. Quote, Lukács' youthful extremism is, so to speak, a methodological extremism, which transcending the empirical content of the problematic of the proletarian revolution, assigns to theory an eminently philosophical role, proposes to theoretical Marxism the elaboration of a dialectical philosophy which is historicist and humanist and substantially modeled after the great Hegelian example, end quote. I'm not sure who said that. As Vaca rightly points out, maybe it's this Vaca person, as Vaca rightly points out, Lukács' concept of method is quite formalistic in its indifference to the content to which the method is to be applied. It appears to imply that such crucial empirical findings as the falling rate of profit, or indeed any of the propositions of Marxist economics, could be rejected without the validity of Marxism being questioned. Yet Lukács as well as Korsch felt that only if Marxism could be understood as a living method and not as a series of received truths, would it be possible to escape from the dogmatic straitjacket placed on Marxism by the Marxists of the Second International. How is this dilemma to be resolved? There's a very important point about method here, which Korsch correctly makes in opposing the tendency to place the dialectic as a formal principle above and beyond any particular content, a tendency to be found in Lukács. The method of dialectical materialism cannot be separated from the material to which it is to be applied, and displayed as a set of formal principles. This is his solution to the problems involved in the two following conceptions of dialectics. The classic statement of the formalist position Lukács adopts was made earlier by Engels. In the book, The Dialectics of Nature, Engels tends to isolate the dialectic and formalize it, as in the famous three laws, negation of the negation, the transformation of quantity into quality, and the unity of opposites. This approach stresses the formal necessity of the dialectic. On the one hand, the social democratic critique of Lukács went to the opposite extreme. For example, in a general critique of neo-Hegelian conceptions of the Marxist dialectic, Marx wrote, quote, bracket, the dialectic, end bracket, ... becomes for Lukács a philosophical worldview, is no longer a heuristic principle of research, end quote. Mark, M-A-R-C-K, I don't know who this Mark is. And I don't know who the Vaca person referenced earlier is either. Marx thus proposes that, as a useful heuristic principle, the dialectic can merely contingently grasp empirical content. Thus form and content are separated, which results in the familiar philosophical dualism of necessity, contingency, universality, particularity, and so on. But the dualisms involved in both these viewpoints had already been resolved in philosophical terms by Hegel. Hegel's advance over Kant was to show that, quote, pure reason, unquote, is in fact historicizable, because it could not in any of its forms be abstracted from the content in which it appeared. The merely formal universal laws of thought, which Kant proposed in opposition to the concrete particularity of the empiricist, were to be transcended by the, quote, concretely universal, unquote, operation of the dialectic. Korsch grasped this point when he writes, quote, Hegel has already taught that a philosophical scientific method was not a mere form of thought which could be applied indiscriminately to any content. ... Marx made the same point in an early writing, quote, form has no value if it is not the form of its content. End quote. Marx, end quote, Korsch. This is a crucial point in Marx's methodology. Unfortunately, Korsch does not show in detail how this relationship is exemplified in the major concepts of Marx. This relationship between form and content is itself grasped formally by Korsch. Thus there is only a passing allusion to this method in his introduction to Marx's critique of the Goode program. Quote, Marx did not proceed to criticize the Goode program by revealing the false and superficial general principle that clearly underlies all its particular sentences and demands, and then simply counterpose the truer and deeper principle of his materialism to it in an equally general form. Marx proceeds inversely by criticizing in the greatest detail each individual passage in the program. End quote. Korsch. The greatest danger which could arise from a tendency to separate the materialist method from its content would be the setting up of a new philosophy of, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote. So far, we have seen that Korsch did not propose to work out a new philosophy. The crucial significance of philosophy lies in the fact that the task of a dialectical materialist restoration of the Marxist position on the problem of ideology, quote, can only be resolved by first investigating the problem which led Marx and Engels to the question of ideology. How is philosophy related to the social revolution of the proletariat? And how is the social revolution of the proletariat related to philosophy? End quote. Korsch. As has already been seen, Korsch was interested not in a chronological but in a logical understanding of the Marxist system. This was because it arose out of real conditions and expressed the real relations of production which brought forth a progressive historical class. Marxism was not an ideology. Its content was given by the historical conditions which gave birth to the proletariat. But how was it structured formally? Korsch answers, quote, according to Engels, socialism in its content is the product of new conceptions that necessarily arise at a definite stage of social development within the proletariat as a result of its material situation. But it created its own specific scientific form, which distinguishes it from utopian socialism by its link with German idealism, especially the philosophical system of Hegel. Socialism, which developed from utopia to science, formally emerged from German idealist philosophy, end quote. Korsch. In reconstructing Marxism, it was important to demonstrate the crucial role philosophy had played in Marx's own intellectual history. Philosophy was a logical moment in the construction of Marxism and a necessary element in Marx's working out a scientific form of the new historical content, the working class struggling for socialism. On the one hand, philosophy is a moment in the scientific critique of capitalism. On the other, philosophy cannot, simply as a matter of merely intellectual supersession, be replaced by this critique. Korsch attempts to resolve this antithesis by referring to the problem to which he was attempting an analogous solution, namely that of the state. the, quote, economic theories of Marxism, end quote, as a refutation and supersession of bourgeois science and philosophy remain on the one side of their being inevitably philosophy and science. On the other side, they step beyond the horizon of bourgeois science and philosophy, end quote. Korsch. In the same passage, Korsch draws the analogy with the state, which the proletariat will set up immediately after its expropriation of the capitalist class. On the one hand, it will still have the character of the state as we know it today. On the other, quote, in its capacity as transitional stage to the classless and thereby stateless communist society of the future, it would no longer be just a, quote, state, but already something higher than a state, end quote. Korsch. It is necessary to carry out this reconstruction because, as with the question of the state, it cannot be assumed that later Marxists were as clear as Marx was on this question. Thus, since Marx's death, we have seen the degeneration of Marx's teaching into the vulgar materialism of the Second International. Marxism itself has to be seen as something variable and part of the historical process. If this is done, it is not possible to regard the crisis of Marxism as arising from the cowardice or deficient revolutionary spirit of those who adopted a vulgar Marxist position, nor must this, quote, restoration of Marxism be merely a rereading of the basic text. What is necessary is to use the Marxist method which has previously been applied to the philosophy of German idealism, and the Marxist theory which emerged from it, to develop Marxism further, namely, quote, we must try to understand every change, development, and revision of Marxist theory since its original emergence from the philosophy of German idealism as a necessary product of its epoch, Hegel. More precisely, we should seek to understand their determination by the totality of the historico-social process of which they are a general expression, Marx, end quote, Korsch. It is clear from this passage that Korsch had a specific intention, the examination of the further development not of Marxism in general, but of the relation between Marxism and philosophy in subsequent periods. It was in missing this point that his, quote, orthodox critics made their major mistake. For example, Kautsky's criticism was that Korsch's periodization referred to the general level of development of Marxism. The deterioration which Korsch saw in the period after 1848, the, quote, impoverishment of Marxism which, quote, occurred during the lifetime of Marx and Engels at a time when the First International was founded and Marx's Capital was published. Marx and Engels were supposedly to blame for this, quote, impoverishment, end quote, themselves, end quote. I'm not sure who this quote is, if it's Korsch or Kautsky. I'm going to say it's Korsch. Oh, no, Kautsky. It is Kautsky. It is Kautsky. Korsch replied to such critics in his anti-critique, and in doing so summarized his own position, quote, they have not tried to show that this periodization was useless, even for the specific purposes of my investigation. They prefer to accuse me of tending to present the whole history of Marxism after 1850 in a negative light, as a single linear and univocal process of decay suffered by the original revolutionary theory of Marx and Engels. As a single linear and univocal process of decay suffered by the original revolutionary theory of Marx and Engels, not only in the domain of the relation of Marxism to philosophy, but in every domain, end quote. Korsch. One of the strengths of the book, Marxism and Philosophy, is its avoidance of the pitfalls of a crude sociology of knowledge approach, often equated with Marxism. This approach argues that ideas serve the interests of particular classes tout court, that is, an unmediated application of Marx's notion that in any society the ruling ideas are those of the ruling class. Korsch ascribes this idea to the, quote, vulgar Marxist, end quote, as their explanation of the persistence of philosophy. Quote, the fact that there are still so many men who are preoccupied by such philosophical, quote, fantasies appeared to them, bracket, the vulgar Marxist, end bracket, to rest only on the circumstance that, the the present ruling capitalist class has an equal interest in maintaining these philosophical, quote, superstitions, as it does in maintaining, quote, religious and all kinds of other specters, end quote. Korsch. Korsch might have added that this crude position is also to be found in Bukharin's book, Historical Materialism, which argues that, quote, bourgeois ideology is just what members of the bourgeoisie think. Quote, the bourgeoisie has also created its own social sciences based on its own practical requirements. The first bourgeois economists were great practical merchants and government leaders, while the greatest theoretician of the bourgeoisie, Ricardo, was a very able banker, end quote, Bukharin. Korsch rightly calls the claim that the bourgeois philosophers place their philosophy or their history of philosophy consciously in the service of one class, a, quote, coarse notion, end quote. Further, the relations between the individual thinker and the social classes are more complex than would be indicated simply from fitting the thinker into a sociological slot and then, quote, explaining ideas on this basis. Marx's position in the 18th Brumaire is that, quote, just as little must one imagine that the democratic representatives are indeed all shopkeepers or enthusiastic champions of shopkeepers. According to their education and their individual position, they may be as far apart as heaven from earth. What makes them representatives of the petty bourgeoisie is the fact that in their minds they do not get beyond the limits which the latter do not get beyond in life. End quote. Marx. While certain problems have been avoided, it is evident from the foregoing that the important question still remains. Is philosophy particularly important in the reconstruction of Marxism? Korsch himself points out that one of the intellectual limits on the bourgeois history of philosophy is that the ideas of philosophy can live on outside philosophy. Quote, the ideas contained in a philosophy can live on not only in philosophies but equally well in positive sciences and social practice. This process precisely began on a large scale with Hegel's philosophy. End quote. Korsch. If this is so, what is the point of studying philosophy as a particular discipline? Although the book, Marxism and Philosophy, convincingly demonstrates the need for Marxists to have a firm grasp of philosophy, in itself it does little to satisfy that need by providing a substantive exposition of philosophy. In fact, there is very little explicit philosophical content in Korsch's work. This may seem rather paradoxical, so to explain this point it is necessary to see what conception of philosophy remains implicit in the book, and then to indicate what lines of actual philosophical inquiry might have been followed. Consider Hegel's conception of the relation of philosophy to the empirical sciences, and his definition of the object of philosophy. I have chosen Hegel as an example because Korsch himself regarded him as the last and most important of bourgeois philosophers. Quote, the method of empirical science exhibits two effects. Quote, the method of empirical science exhibits two defects. The first is that the universal or general principle contained in it is not on its own account connected with the particulars of the details. The second defect is that the beginnings are in every case data and postulates, being neither accounted for nor deduced. In both these points, the form of necessity fails to get its due. End quote. Hegel. As we have seen, Korsch does not actually discuss whether philosophy shall be, quote, queen of the sciences, nor does he discuss, quote, empirical science as such, but only the positivist conception of philosophy. A Marxist analysis of philosophy would surely have to concentrate on a demonstration of the nature of dialectical logic and an explanation of how it differs from formal logic, in their opposition as logics of proof and discovery. At the very least, it would have to demonstrate Hegel's refutation of Kant's warning against, quote, dialectic. Quote, it may be noted as a sure and useful warning that general logic, if viewed as an organon, is always a logic of illusion, that is dialectical. For logic teaches us nothing whatsoever regarding the content of knowledge, but lays down only the formal conditions of agreement with the understanding. ... That any attempt to use this logic as a ... bracket organon in bracket ... can end in nothing but mere talk. End quote. Hegel. This is a much more fundamental approach. It would deal with the key question of the formal side of Marxism as its most general, in terms of the problem. I think it's supposed to say at its most general. I think that's what it's supposed to say. This is a much more fundamental approach. It would deal with the key question of the formal side of Marxism as its most general, in terms of the problem of the necessity of the dialectic, while at the same time showing what was meant by its contingency. Korsch does not approach the question at such a level of philosophical complexity. However, it does seem to have been his original intention to deal with these questions. When the book Marxism and Philosophy first appeared as an essay in the Gutenberg archive, he said that it was the first part of a longer work of historico-logical investigation into the question of the Marxist dialectic. I feel that Korsch was in fact concerned with a much narrower philosophical problematic than the one outlined above, namely the antinomy between freedom and causality, which was stated by Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason as follows, quote, "Causality in accordance with the laws of nature is not the only causality from which the appearances of the world can one and all be derived. To explain these appearances is necessary to assume that there is another causality, that of freedom," end quote. Kant. The, quote, "determinist antithesis is that, quote, there is no freedom, everything in the world takes place solely in accordance with the laws of nature," end quote. And I'm not sure who that quote is, it might be Kant. In my opinion, Korsch is mainly concerned with one of the dualisms first stated by Kant. Unlike his contemporary Lukács, who devoted a long essay in the book History and Class Consciousness to this question, Kant does not examine dualism as a basic feature of all modern philosophical thought. In his brilliant essay titled Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, Lukács set himself the task of analyzing the, quote, antinomies of bourgeois thought, end quote. Basing himself on Marx's economic analyses, and going on to discuss the problems growing out of the fetish character of commodities, Lukács' philosophical analysis was much more sophisticated and wide-ranging than Korsch's. Quote, "Modern critical philosophy springs from the reified structure of consciousness. The specific problems of this philosophy are distinguishable from the problematics of previous philosophies by the fact that they are rooted in this structure. But as the problems and solutions of the philosophy of the ancients were embedded in a wholly different society, it is only natural that they should be qualitatively different from those of modern philosophy," end quote. Lukács. Korsch's philosophical critique is by comparison rather superficial and not so clearly or explicitly linked to the fundamentals of the Marxist system. Korsch's purely philosophical critique is therefore not fundamental enough. Thus, for the reconstruction of Marxism, Korsch's analysis of the logical position of philosophy, the relation of Marx to Hegel and Kant, is inadequate. This might not matter so much if the proposals for the part to be played by the critique of philosophy in the development of Marxism were at all satisfactory, but in terms of Korsch's own criterion, that is, practice, they are equally inadequate. The practical proposals are stated at the end of the book, Marxism and Philosophy, as follows. The economic action of the proletariat needs to be supplemented not only by political, but also by, quote, intellectual, geistige action. Before the seizure of power, this applies to a, quote, revolutionary scientific, end quote, critique of existing society, and at a less rarefied level, to agitation or work. When the proletariat is in power, it must exercise a, quote, ideological dictatorship, unquote. What is valid for the intellectual action against the forms of consciousness of existing society is especially valid for philosophical action. Quote, bourgeois consciousness, must be philosophically fraught by the revolutionary materialistic dialectic, which is the philosophy of the working class. This struggle will only end when the whole of existing society and its economic basis have been totally overthrown in practice, and this consciousness has been totally surpassed and abolished in theory, end quote. Korsch. Such proposals for, quote, intellectual action are, it has to be said, rather vacuous. It would be difficult to draw any specific directives from them. This is a serious failing in a work whose central aim is to analyze philosophy primarily from a practical and not simply a theoretical point of view. Given this emphasis on practice, what is most surprising is that there is no mention of the role of the party. By the time Korsch wrote Marxism and Philosophy, the question of the party had already been extensively discussed at the third and fourth Congresses of the Comintern. Given that during this period Korsch did follow the orthodox line about Leninism and the party, it's fair to discuss this question here is rather surprising. In this respect, Lukács succeeded in drawing political conclusions from his philosophical analysis of Marxism. For example, in the essay, quote, Towards a Methodology of the Problem of Organization, end quote, and the study on Lenin, published only 1 year after History and Class Consciousness. In this chapter, I have criticized some misconceptions about the book Marxism and Philosophy, mainly concerning the differences between Korsch and Lukács on this question, as well as examining the work itself. I now want to briefly summarize my findings on these two questions. Ever since Zinoviev bracketed Korsch and Lukács together at the 5th Congress of the Comintern, this amalgam technique has been uncritically repeated by most subsequent writers, friendly or hostile. Unfortunately, the revival of interest in their philosophical work, initiated by Merleau-Ponty, The Adventures of the Dialectic of 1955, repeated this mistake. In the earlier criticisms in the 1920s, this also meant ascribing to Korsch positions he did not in fact hold on the dialectic of nature, as well as failing to distinguish more carefully between his and Lukács' ideas on other questions. Following Zinoviev's lead, other Comintern critics hurried to the attack, quote, a disfigured, falsified Marxism is beginning to take shape in their, bracket, the European Communist parties, and bracket, ranks. As an example of such deformations and morbid growths, the philosophical performances of Lukács, Korsch, and Fogarasi and others are outstanding, end quote. I'm not sure who that quote is from. As I have shown, there are in fact important differences between Korsch and Lukács. Korsch shows a superior understanding of Marxism, and by any criterion has a more justifiable position in relation to two questions. Firstly, Korsch realizes that it is incorrect to make such a rigid separation between form, method, and content as Lukács does. In some sense, the method has to be justified by the content it is able to establish. Lukács overreacts against empiricist conceptions of verification to fall into the formalist trap of elevating method into a self-sufficient principle. Korsch recognizes that in Marxism, form and content are intimately linked. Secondly, Korsch argues, correctly in my view, that the concept of totality does not have such a preeminent place in Marx's system as Lukács suggested. Korsch does agree that, unlike, quote, bourgeois social science, Marxism attempts to integrate the separate, quote, disciplines of sociology, economics, politics, history, etc. into a unified whole, and that, quote, totality is an important feature of the Marxist system, but not the dominant one. On the other hand, the book, Marxism and Philosophy, has two important faults, one in relation to Lukács' argument, the other in relation to the problem of philosophy. In his critique of Second International Marxism, Korsch tends to ignore the variety of forms it could adopt. Thus, he concentrates on its determinist positivist aspect and fails to realize that it can have the opposite aspect of voluntarism idealism. That's a very interesting statement. I'm going to repeat it. In his critique of Second International Marxism, Korsch tended to ignore the variety of forms it could adopt. Thus, he concentrates on its determinist positive aspect and fails to realize that it can have the opposite aspect of voluntarism idealism. It would be nice if Goode gave some examples of this. Lukács' more philosophically sophisticated critique of the dualisms inherent in, quote, bourgeois and hence social democratic thought is able to show how these opposites can coexist in an unresolved dualism. This point can be strikingly illustrated by referring to two positions held by Hilferding. In the book Marxism and Philosophy, Korsch rightly draws attention to the determinism implicit in the position taken by Hilferding in his preface to Finance Capital. Yet, only 4 years after the book Marxism and Philosophy, Hilferding could write, quote, "We have always thought that the fall of the capitalist system is not to be expected in a fatalistic manner. It will not be a result of the inner laws of the system, but the fall of the capitalist system must be the conscious deed of the working class, ... Marxism has never been fatalism, but on the contrary, the most extreme activism," and Hilferding. The point is that Korsch's outlook could not allow for such a swing from one polar opposite to the other. More fundamentally, Korsch's views on the relation between Marxism and philosophy remains unproved. Korsch did succeed in distancing himself from the conception that it is necessary to provide a philosophy for Marxism, as for example Max Adler had suggested. Quote, "Kant's ethic is the philosophical expression of the human goals of socialism. ... The categorical imperative is the idea of a universal law-giving by the will, in which there can no longer be any oppression by any willing subject. The demand that no man is to be used only as a means, but is also to be regarded as an end, is an idea which totally excludes exploitation," and Max Adler. Korsch also succeeded in showing the importance of philosophy as a historical component in the development of the Marxist system. But the logical status of philosophy is not clear. Korsch's argument stops at the very point at which it should have begun. Korsch seems to accept a position similar to that put forward by Engels in the book Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. Quote, "With Hegel, philosophy comes to an end. On the one hand, because in his system he summed up its whole development in the most splendid fashion, and on the other hand, because even though unconsciously, he showed us the way out of the labyrinth of systems to real positive knowledge of the world." End quote. Engels. Wait, no, who's that? Whose quote is that? No, it's definitely Engels. But Korsch does not explain what is meant by, quote, "positive knowledge," nor does he provide any instance of such knowledge about ideologies. Thus his work is only a part of the prolegomenon to the study of the book Marxism and Philosophy, but an indispensable part nonetheless. Very confused by that last paragraph. It is perhaps ironic that the book, Marxism and Philosophy, attracted such bitter and unjustified criticisms from the defenders of orthodoxy, since it's much more faithful to the letter of Marx and Lenin's writings than is the book Labor Law for Factory Councils. But unfortunately, in the year following its publication, the quote, "Bolshevization campaign" began in all the European communist parties. In the next chapter, we shall see how Korsch, who initially was a fervent supporter of the campaign, soon became a victim of it. And that's the end of chapter 4 proper. Now I'm going to look at the end notes. Let's see. It says, "Unless otherwise stated, quotations from Korsch, Marxism and Philosophy are from the English translation by Fred Halliday." um, 1970. I guess Fred Halliday, being from New Left Review, translated the book. Um, he has a book. He has an essay on this channel called I think it's called The Jihadism of Fools. In his otherwise rather non-committal review, Marcuse praises Marxism and Philosophy for its historical account of Marxist conceptions of philosophy. And that review is from 1931. Korsch added, quote, "This will be studied further in a later work," end quote, but Korsch was not to return to this point until his views had changed substantially. See Lenin's article on the significance of militant materialism. See Lenin's conspectus of Hegel's Science of Logic. Lenin's once again on the trade unions. And the article on the significance of militant materialism. See Istvan Mazaros's book Lukács's Concept of Dialectic. See Martin Jay's The Dialectical Imagination. Gramsci Prison Notebooks. Trotsky Lessons of October. It says this was to be more of a problem in connection with his later critique of the Lenin of materialism and imperial criticism. See Korsch's article, see Korsch's essay, The Marxism of the First International, which I think is in Marxism and Philosophy. Quote, "Economists explain to us how production is carried on in the ... given conditions, but they do not explain how these conditions are themselves produced, i.e. the historical movement which calls them to life," end quote. Marx, Poverty of Philosophy. Bukharin's theory of historical materialism. Sorry. See Kant, The Antinomy of Pure Reason, Third Conflict of the Transcendental Ideas, Second Part, Transcendental Logic. See Lukács, Towards a Methodology of the Problem of Organization. See F. Jakubowski's book, Ideology and Superstructure and Historical Materialism. That's from 1936. I think it's which was the first work to attempt to revive interest in Korsch and Lukács, but it passed virtually unnoticed at the time. And see Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach on the End of Classical German Philosophy. Okay, so those are the end notes. Thank you so much for listening.